Tak ještě jednou dobré ráno, ať už nečekáme, já bych zahájila dnešní seminář. Já jsem Eva Chvalkovská z projektu na podporu odpovědného veřejného zadávání, respektive strategického zadávání veřejných zakázek. Vítám vás na dnešním semináři Institutu pro odpovědné veřejné zadávání, který pořádá tyto online semináře, ale můžete je zhlédnout potom i ze záznamu samozřejmě. Náš projekt poskytuje také konzultace nebo další rady, jak implementovat odpovědné veřejné zadávání, které je v podstatě teď povinné od 1.1.2021. Založili jsme také platformu, kde máme už více než 20 zadavatelů, kteří si vyměňují velice neformálně a prakticky zkušenosti s odpovědným veřejným zadáváním, takže pokud byste o ní také měli zájem, určitě vás do ní jako zadavatele přijmeme. A dnešní seminář s názvem ISO 20400 pokyny pro udržitelné nakupování v praxi veřejného zadavatele bude trvat zhruba do 12:30. Věřím, že nám pan lektor dá i nějakou přestávku a je rozdělen vlastně na dvě části. Ta dnešní bude takovou úvodní, více prezentační a ta druhá část, která bude 2.2. v podobném čase, bude potom ještě více praktická. A já jsem velice ráda, že tento seminář pro nás opět připravil Shaun McCarthy, který je ředitelem společnosti Action Sustainability. Shaun byl vedoucím britské delegace, která vlastně se podílela přímo na vytváření těchto pokynů 20400. Shaun je velice zkušený expertem na odpovědné nakupování, a to jak v soukromém, tak ve veřejném sektoru. Radil mnoha subjektům právě z obou těchto sektorů. Je také zakladatelem nebo jedním ze zakladatelů stránky ISO 20400, a nebo také velice dobré praktické stránky, na které lze získat řadu informací Supply Chain Sustainability School. Já bych ještě trošičku se věnovala technickým věcem, které je potřeba, když jsme takhle online, obzvláště zdůraznit. Chtěla bych zopakovat i to, co jste už dostali v e-mailu, že tento seminář bude interaktivní. Pokusíme se takhle i online zařídit jistou interaktivitu, aby vám byl co největším přínosem. Můžete se ptát, diskutovat, a proto, pokud možno, chtěla bych vás všechny vyzvat, abyste si zapli kameru, protože to pomůže i vidět vaše reakce, takže to bude super, pokud to bude stíhat vaše připojení. Takže děkuji třeba Martinovi Rajmanovi, který si ji právě zapnul. A seminář tlumočíme a je to poprvé, co to děláme. Věříme, že všechno bude fungovat. A pokud byste s tím měli nějaké potíže, dejte nám vědět. Dole vlastně na té liště je taková ikonka globusu, kde si ty jazyky lze přepínat, takže já věřím, že to bude fungovat, ať už budete chtít poslouchat potom v angličtině nebo v češtině, nebo si to měnit, takže snad to bude všechno OK. Tlumočení nám zajišťují dvě naše tlumočnice, se kterými dlouhodobě spolupracujeme, Jana Markvartová a Lucie Lukavská. A protože s tím zvukem to, doufejme, nebude zas moc komplikované, ale aby vše fungovalo, bylo by ideální, kdybyste si zapli mikrofony na tu dobu, kdy budete mluvit, abychom se nerušili právě i kvůli tomu tlumočení nějakými dalšími zvuky. Dole, pokud znáte Zoom, všichni víte, že dole jsou ikonky, které můžete využívat, ať už je to chat, anebo ikonky obličeje, kde můžete dávat své reakce nebo zvednout ruku, pokud budete chtít se přihlásit a přispět do diskuze, ale Shaun se ještě k těm technickým věcem bude trochu věnovat a řekne vám, jak by si tu diskuzi případně dál představoval. Chtěla bych ještě zrekapitulovat materiály, které jste od nás dostali. Doufám, že jste se nezalekli. Poslali jsme vám všem odkaz přímo na celý překlad těch pokynů ISO, ale i Shaun nám poskytl zkrácenou verzi, jak v angličtině, my jsme vám ji poskytli i v češtině, takže doufám, že jste měli čas se na to podívat, projít si ty materiály. Žádali jsme také, abyste si udělali takové rychlé sebehodnocení, jak vaše organizace si stojí vůči těm pokynům, tak na to přijde ještě určitě dneska řeč. Měli byste mít taky už k dispozici prezentaci Shauna, který bude dneska i procházet, ale je to spíš jako pro vaše podklady, nebo kdyby náhodou něco nefungovalo, já věřím, že všechno dneska fungovat bude. A také dneska využijeme technickou funkci Zoomu, což je dělení do skupin a zadání úkolů, které tam budete mít, jste už dostali předem, protože chceme si být jistí, aby jsme se vzájemně pochopili a rozuměli jste tomu, co byste měli mezi sebou diskutovat, i bez vlastně možná přispění nás, organizátorů, takže budeme rádi, když si to potom vezmete k ruce. A samozřejmě technické problémy doufáme, že všichni máme dobře připraveno, a kdyby však nastaly, můžete kontaktovat Terezu nebo Ivu, na jejich mobil jste vlastně také dostali v e-mailu, nebo nějak nám naznačit v chatu, že třeba něco nefunguje, tak ale doufám, že díky firmě Pozitiv a panu Jiřímu, který je taky připojený, bude vlastně dneska všechno dobře fungovat. Poslední taková technická poznámka, seminář nahráváme, protože bychom ho chtěli potom zprostředkovat i těm, kteří se ho dneska nemohli zúčastnit, samozřejmě v nějaké sestříhané podobě. A pokud někoho znáte, koho by to zajímalo, můžete určitě potom pozvat po té druhé části, už to bude zpřístupněno online. Takže já všem děkuji, kteří se dnes připojili. Velice děkuji a vítám Shauna McCarthyho a tímto mu předávám slovo.
Okay, thank you, Ava, and good morning and welcome to everybody. I was really relieved to hear that I could hear the translation in English. As Ava said, this is the first time that we've actually run a simultaneously translated workshop online. So I hope it goes well. I'm sure it will. The team in Prague have done a lot of preparation. So yes, thank you very much for welcoming me today. I'm going to share my screen and pull up some slides and get the session started. So hopefully you can see my screen now, and I make that go away. And I put that up onto full screen. Okay, so as Ava said in the introduction, this is a workshop today on embedding sustainable procurement using the ISO standard, ISO 2400. This is the agenda for the day. We'll do some introductions. So what we'll do at that stage is we'll go around the virtual room and ask you to introduce yourselves and what you do and what you would expect to get out of today. I've asked Ava to run that introductory session so I don't embarrass myself mispronouncing all the Czech names. Then we're going to talk very briefly about sustainability and what it means, and I've got a short video to show you there, which hopefully will work with the translations. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about sustainable procurement and what that is. I've got another short video to show you when we talk about that, and then I'm going to take you through the structure of the ISO standard, I guess is the best way to describe it. So the fundamentals, policy and strategy, enablers and procurement process with a little summary at the end. I have two interactive exercises for you during the day this morning, but then in the second session you'll be working in groups pretty much throughout the session. So it's really about day one is about learning what to practice, and day two is practicing what you've learned. So do be prepared on the second session to be working in groups and coming up with some real examples that we can work on with regard to sustainable procurement. Okay, I think Ava has introduced me, so I probably don't need to say very much. Yeah, I'm Shaun McCarthy. I'm a Director of Action Sustainability. I'm also Chair of the Supply Chain Sustainability School in the UK. I've got a long background in procurement. I was a procurement professional for probably about 25 years and got into sustainability sustainability a number of years ago. I founded Action Sustainability in 2006 because there was a lot of government action in the UK around sustainable procurement at the time, and I was involved in the UK Sustainable Procurement Task Force. So I started a business because there really wasn't very much help for people out there around sustainable procurement. I also chaired something for 8 years, which was the Commission for a Sustainable London 2012. And that was an independent assurance body that provides oversight around sustainability for the London Olympics, which seems an awful long time ago now, but it was quite an experience. So that's me, briefly. I'd like to hand over to Ava now. I'm going to stop sharing, and Ava, if you could maybe just go around the room and ask people to introduce themselves. Please feel free to use either language. If you're fluent in English, then please do speak in English. If not, then speak in Czech, and I'll pick up the translation. So please, yes, if you can just introduce yourself, who you are, what organisation you're from. And if there is one thing that you would like to get from the session over the next 2 days, what would that be? Okay, I'll hand back to you if I can, Ava, to run the introductions. Thank you.
Děkuju. Já se to pokusím vlastně udělat tak, jak my jsme si připravili vás i pro to rozdělení do skupin. A mně se tedy velice těžko teď poznává, kdo v které skupině vlastně, teda já vím, kdo v které skupině je, ale nevím, jestli jste všichni připojení. Tak já, pokud to půjde, zkusím to projít ve smyslu rozdělení do skupin a udělám si s tím takovou docházku, kdo nám vlastně chybí, a možná ty skupinky potom trošku přeskupíme, protože podle počtu přihlášených lidí nejsme úplně všichni přihlášení. A já mám na prvním místě v první skupině Marcelu Kukijovou, kterou vidím, že je připojená. Tak poprosím, Marcelo, dávám vám slovo, jestli byste se mohla představit a říct, co byste očekávala od semináře.
Takže dobrý den, zdravím všechny, slyšíme se?
Slyšíme.
No. Tak zabývám se zadáváním veřejných zakázek na statutárním městě Chomutov, jednak pro město, pro všechny organizace a obchodní společnosti města, spíš se orientuju samozřejmě na zakázky dle zákona. Sleduju aktivity ohledně odpovědného veřejného zadávání, udržitelného zadávání už mnoho let. A přestože...
Jo, asi se mi to povedlo.
Ano, někdo nám do toho skočil.
Děkuji.
A
Marcelo, teď neslyšíme. Mikrofon, prosím, Marcelo, neslyšíme.
Už, teď.
Už.
A přestože si myslím, že mám hodně teoretických jako znalostí, tak pořád si myslím, že ta praxe ještě není u nás na městě dobrá. Netvrdím, že to ze dne na den změním, chce to trošičku ten tým rozšířit a víc zaangažovat, takže očekávám, že dneska pomocí těch cvičení a pomocí tady těch skupin možná zase posunu se trošku dál, jak zaktivizovat větší množství lidí u nás. To je všechno. Děkuju a zdravím všechny.
Děkuju moc. A do první skupinky jsme také zařadili Jakuba Váňu z Jihomoravského kraje, kterého jsem viděla, že je také připojený, takže předávám slovo.
Dobrý den, ahoj. Já jsem Jakub Váňa z Jihomoravského kraje. Zakázkám se taky věnuju už poměrně dlouho. Dneska ten seminář pro mě bude takové řekl bych, jako opakování a pohled s odstupem na něco, co my jsme absolvovali vlastně už zhruba 2 roky zpátky, vším to tak je, kdy jsme vlastně se Shaunem byli na semináři v Praze a bylo to pro nás tenkrát velmi zajímavé. Hodně nás to posunulo dopředu, protože jsme vlastně začali víc pracovat s normou ISO 24100 a vyzkoušeli jsme si ty kroky, které tam jsou pro zadavatele, čili prováděli jsme nějaké sebehodnocení, analýzu našich hnacích sil, zainteresovaných stran a podobně. Takže já se těším, že se na to teď podíváme s odstupem těch 2 let nebo roku a půl, podíváme se, kam jsme se posunuli, co se změnilo a jak se můžeme posouvat zase o kus dál do budoucna.
Děkuju. Teď bych poprosila paní Renatu Konvalinovou, taky jsem viděla, že je připojená.
Dobrý den. Dobrý den. Já bych řekla, že jsem v téhleté oblasti naprostý nováček, takže se určitě nechám ráda poučit.
A jste z Nového Města nad Metují, je to tak?
Ano.
Dobrá, děkuju. A Tomáš Vápeník?
Ode mě. Já jsem z města Chrudim, z městského úřadu, z odboru investic, a protože přicházím do styku s vypisováním výběrových řízení, tak čekám od tohoto semináře, že mi přinese v podstatě jako nováčkovi v tomhletom oboru aspoň prvotní informace a budu se snažit dalšími školeními se zdokonalovat v tomto oboru. Děkuji.
Děkuji. Pak jsem tady měla ještě pana Jana Valouška, ale ten buď se rychle zahlásí, anebo mám pocit, že ho tady nevidím mezi účastníky. A ještě se dovolím zmínit, že vlastně z našeho týmu je také pár lidí připojeno. Já teď s dovolením přeskočím, potom když se někdo objeví od nás z Ministerstva práce a sociálních věcí ve vaší skupince, tak potom se i zapojíme do těch diskuzí. V další skupince máme Lenku Holerovou, takže zdravím a předávám slovo.
Dobrý den, slyšíme se?
Slyšíme.
Zdravím z Jičína, děkuji za pozvání na dnešní seminář. ISO 2400, nechci říct, že je pro nás úplně novinka, částečně z něho čerpáme, nicméně určitě se těšíme na ty následující 2 dny, že se toho dozvíme mnohem více, protože ho spíše používáme z té teoretické části a určitě budeme rádi za všechny příklady, které tady zazní a hlavně za té bratské od Shauna. Takže uvidíme a těšíme se a doufáme, že nám to něco přinese. Děkujeme.
Děkuju. Pak bychom tu měli mít ještě Jakuba Šilhana z Jihomoravského kraje, ale tuším, že také není připojený. Já dávám šanci se ozvat, ale myslím, že není mezi přihlášenými. Dalším účastníkem je Marek Ciprian. Doufám, že čtu jméno správně. Předávám slovo. Nepodaří se mi to. Já jsem ho viděla připojeného, ale vypadá to, že zatím znovu připojen není. Soňa Černá a nebo Radka Škubalová. Radka Škubalová je připojená, vidím, předávám slovo.
Dobrý den, já všechny zdravím. Jsem z města Příbram, které zakázkám se věnuji už od roku 2011 a poslední zhruba 2,5 roku se snažíme o aplikaci Institutu odpovědného zadávání. Jsme členy i platformy odpovědného zadávání, kde se setkáváme s kolegy a sdílíme si informace. A od toho dnešního školení očekáváme jakoby vhled do té normy, kterou zatím víme o ní a víme o ní zatím jenom teoreticky. Takže děkuji.
Děkuji. Další v pořadí mám paní Moniku Mrkvičkovou ze Státního pozemkového úřadu, ale také mám pocit, že ji úplně nevidím. Je-li tam někde, ať se ozve.
Bohužel dneska není přítomna.
Dobrá, děkuji paní Vokřálová. Možná vemte si slovo a můžete se představit za vás, za obě.
Dobrý den, já vás všechny zdravím. Jak už bylo řečeno, já jsem ze Státního pozemkového úřadu, pracuji na odboru veřejných zakázek. Jsme také členy platformy od května minulého roku. Snažíme se, máme takové první krůčky, teď samozřejmě s novelou zákona už se musíme snažit také víc v oblasti odpovědného zadávání. Momentálně hledáme nové možnosti. do našich zakázek, tak samozřejmě dnešní školení, dnešní seminář pro nás bude velkou inspirací.
Děkuji. V další skupince by měl být potom Martin Rajman z České televize. Předávám slovo.
Dobré ráno.
Vpravo má být nějaká nebo dole má.
Mé jméno je Martin Rajman, jsem vedoucí centrálního nákupu České televize a v podstatě jsem tady, protože chci dělat svoji práci dobře.
Super, děkuju. Z ČEZu bychom měli mít paní Janu Kačurikovou a to se přiznám, že jsem neviděla, nevím, jestli je připojená. Neozývá se, uvidíme třeba později. A Andrea Aulehlová. Předávám slovo, Andreo.
Dobrý den, já všechny moc zdravím z dopravního podniku hlavního města Prahy. A vlastně už více jak rok spolupracujeme s Ministerstvem práce a sociálních věcí. Jsme účastníky platformy odpovědného veřejného zadávání a moc těšíme na novinky z dnešního školení.
Děkuju. Tahle skupinka je taková skupinka, ve které jsou státní podniky a mezi nimi by měl být i Zbyněk Pochmon z Povodí Vltavy. Předávám slovo.
Dobrý den všem, doufám, že se slyšíme. Jak již bylo řečeno, zastupuji Povodí Vltavy, které se soustředuje primárně na zadávání veřejných zakázek na stavební práce. V oblasti odpovědného zadávání je Povodí Vltavy aktivní už několik let, přičemž i na základě teď nové zákonné povinnosti se snažíme o rozšíření našich aktivit v této oblasti a vlastně ode dneška očekávám nabrání nových zkušeností a inspirací.
Děkuji. Ještě bych se chtěla dotázat, jestli je tu Kateřina Svobodová. Neviděla jsem a je možné, že mi někdo unikne občas, ale neozývá se. Paní Svobodová by měla být z oblastní nemocnice Náchod, tak uvidíme, jestli se připojí později. A dalším ve skupince se státními podniky je Lukáš Křesálek, ale není ze státního podniku. Pane Křesálku, můžu vás pozvat k představení?
Ano, dobrý den. Prozatím jsem černá ovce rodiny. Jsem z prostřední strany, jsem vlastně administrátor veřejných zakázek, takže v podstatě se všemi vámi jakoby většinou spolupracuji. Neříkám, že někoho z vás znám, to ne, ale zase mám ty zkušenosti od vícero zadavatelů, takže nemám tu slepotu, že dělám jenom pro jednoho zadavatele. Takže si myslím, že by to mohlo být taky pozitivní pro vaši skupinu, když každý jakoby máte to svoje a takový ten vhled, jak to dělají ostatní, nebo jak to dělá úplně někdo jiný, by tam mohl chybět, takže věřím, že vám to nějak jako vyvážím a jako věnuju se tomu jako strašnou řádku let a vždycky jako, teď to není ani o tom, že byla novela, ale vždycky jsme se snažili jako o to, aby prostě ten nákup proběhl dobře a aby na konci byl zadavatel spokojený s tím prostě, co obdrží, nebo jak byla ta zakázka provedena. Čili pro mě to je vždycky jakoby prioritní a tady od toho očekávám, že zase jakoby rozšířím obzor o tu problematiku. Děláme to v podstatě to, co se tam píše, tak snažíme se už více kriteriální hodnocení třeba dělat více jak prostě 2-3 roky a opravdu už si nepamatuji ani zakázku, když jsme jeli na cenu. A v podstatě jako jsem za to rád, že to organizujete a rád se to zúčastním a všechny ještě jednou zdravím a děkuju.
Perfektní, děkuju moc. Teď bych se chtěla zeptat, jestli je přítomná paní Marcela Štrobichová, která by měla být z Ministerstva životního prostředí. Myslím, neviděla jsem, nehlásí se, kdyby náhodou někoho už přešla, přihlásili byste se později, přihlašte se potom. A chtěla bych pozvat k představení paní Hanu Dostálovou, tu vidím.
Dobrý den, já jsem ze státní energetické inspekce, což je organizační složka státu. My víceméně se v tuhle chvíli rozkoukáváme, je to pro nás novinka, rozkoukáváme se hlavně s ohledem na novelizaci zákona o zadávání veřejných zakázek a doufám, že tenhle seminář mi pomůže načerpat inspiraci, tak abych to potom při tom zadávání lépe uchopila a správně uchopila. A my víceméně zadáváme vlastně jenom veřejné zakázky malého rozsahu a kriteriální hodnocení jsme zatím aplikovali jenom jednou. Tak to je asi tak všechno.
Děkuju. Z úřadu vlády Veronika Štipáková, ale mám pocit, že nevidím mezi zúčastněnými, přihlášenými, takže jdeme dál. Paní Hana Virtová ze Státního úřadu inspekce práce. Podle mě také ne, můžu se mýlit. A Zdeněk Cvejn z Univerzity Karlovy. Máme totiž dnes, by mělo být pár účastníků z vysokých škol z univerzit, takže pana Cvejna bych pozvala k představení.
Dobrý den, jmenuji se Zdeněk Cvejn, pracuji na Univerzitě Karlově jako vedoucí odboru veřejných zakázek rektorátu. Univerzita má to specifikum, že své zakázky má rozdělené mezi jednotlivé fakulty a součásti a rektorát dělá obslužnost jednak teda toho centra a jednak větší zakázky, respektive centrální zakázky pro fakulty a součásti. A od dnešního semináře očekávám to, že se dozvím, jakým způsobem nastavit procesy pro udržitelné nákupy přes celou univerzitu. Jsou inspirativní informace už v těch dokumentech, které jsme obdrželi, jinak s odpovědným zadáváním už nějakou dobu pracujeme, ale zatím určitě ne v takové míře detailu, jak se předpokládá třeba v té normě 2400. Děkuju.
Děkuju. A z další vysoké školy bych pozvala k představení paní Veroniku Pijáčkovou.
Dobrý den, všechny zdravím. Představuji se vám tady za Vysoké učení technické v Brně, taky za rektorát. Máme ty procesy nastavené stejně, jak říkal pan magistr Cvejn, a přímo s normou ISO 2400 jsme zatím nepracovali, takže ten seminář bude, doufám, každopádně teda přínosný.
Děkuji.
Dobrý den.
Děkuji. Petra Kopová.
Dobrý den, pracuji jako manažer veřejných zakázek pro Masarykovu univerzitu a v letošním roce jsme si dali za cíl vytvořit nějakou strategii odpovědného zadávání, takže budeme rádi za jakékoliv poznatky, které bychom mohli při přípravě využít.
Děkuji. Z ČVUT bychom měli mít paní Lucii Caltovou, ale neviděla jsem, možná se přihlásí později. A k této skupince univerzit jsem přiřadila i paní Dagmar Millerovou Práškovou. Dagmar, máte slovo.
Dobrý den, já pracuji v Institutu cirkulární ekonomiky. My vlastně pořádáme kurz, taky onlineový kurz jsme spustili v listopadu, v říjnu na cirkulární zadávání a ono se to velmi překrývá právě s odpovědným zadáváním, protože my říkáme, že cirkulární ekonomika se opírá o 3 základní pilíře udržitelnosti a to je jak ten sociální, tak i ekonomický a environmentální. Takže já myslím, že jednak se dovím spoustu nových věcí a druhá si myslím, že bychom zase mohli tu debatu obohatit i o tu naší cirkulární ekonomiku, která je vlastně klíčová teď i v rámci zelené dohody a celé té debaty okolo udržitelnosti do budoucna.
Super, děkuju. A já musím potvrdit, cirkulární ekonomika, že je velice zajímavá i samozřejmě součástí odpovědného zadávání. Já jsem moc ráda, že se toho kurzu, o kterém Dagmar tady mluvila, i můžu účastnit přímo já. K dalším přihlášeným, ale pochybuji, že teď přítomným patří Michal Polanecký. Myslím, že ne. Lenka Ingrová z Jihomoravského kraje. A pak už tu mám Lenku Hruškovou, tu jsem na seznamu viděla, takže předávám slovo. Tak. Neslyšíme a teď si nejsem jistá, jestli je teď vidět, ale vím, že přihlášená byla. Tak vypadá to, že zatím ne. Jakub Prašivka. Jakube, máte slovo.
Dobrý den. Já jsem z úřadu městské části Praha 7 a vlastně taky očekám, že se to naučím něco nového, protože jsme s normou 2400 taky ještě nepracovali.
Děkuju. Věra Havlová, vidím na seznamu. Jo, neslyším vás zatím, nevím, jestli už mluvíte. Tak já možná o Věře řeknu. Aha, nemá mikrofon a pouze sleduje. Věra Havlová je z města Děčín a má na starosti zadávání veřejných zakázek v rámci této toho města. Mohli jsme jí slyšet také vlastně o tom, jak to u nich dělají na naší konferenci, která proběhla koncem minulého roku. No a pak už tu mám Evu Gregorovou, už se blížíme ke konci, už se budeme všichni znát. Ano, vidíme, už slyšíme asi.
Dobrý den, já jsem z magistrátu města Brna, z odboru strategického rozvoje a spolupráce. Zde mám na starosti oblast sociologie, sociologických výzkumů, demografie a vlastně s odpovědným zadáváním žádné zkušenosti nemáme, nebo já nemám a vlastně budu se ale podílet na nějaké metodice, která by odpovědné zadávání dostala do procesu zadávání veřejných zakázek.
Perfektní, děkuji. A paní Dita Ohnoutková.
Tak dobrý den, my vás zdravíme tady s kolegyní z Jihomoravského kraje. Na tento seminář se těšíme, protože s normou ISO 24 jsme se nějak přímo nesetkali, tak aby jsme s ní pracovali, když teda u nás na úřadě už se s ní pracuje poměrně další dobu, tak my jsme v těch zakázkách jako docela nováčci, takže se těšíme, co se dozvíme nového.
Děkuji. Lenka Haraštová. Nejsem si jistá, takže hlásí se, nehlásí se. A paní Eva Vlastníková. Paní Vlastníková vidím, že je připojená, ale neslyšíme ji, nevidíme ji. Tak já možná dodám, že paní Vlastníková je z Městské policie Česká Lípa a možná se nás bude taky jenom dneska poslouchat. Ještě bych chtěla představit svoje kolegy. Tereza a Iva, už jsem o nich mluvila, že nám pomáhají velmi technicky, ale měla by být připojená i Natálie Štěpánková, která je tak trošku na MPSV a tak trochu na Masarykově univerzitě. Na ty chceš představit, co pro nás děláš?
Dobrý den, já vás všichni zdravím, tak jenom krátce, já se vlastně v našem týmu odpovědného zadávání zabývám možnostmi měření a monitoringu právě odpovědného zadávání.
Děkuju a my se těšíme, že vlastně i toho se dotkneme v rámci tohoto semináře, jak se dá měřit odpovědné zadávání nebo ten přínos, ten dopad. Dál by měla být připojena Marie Janečková, která zaštiťuje vlastně celý institut odpovědného zadávání pro vás. Marie, nevím, jestli chceš pozdravit, můžeš se případně připojit a potom by...
Já vás všichni zdravím, den, jestli mě slyšíte. Předem se omluvím, já si nezapnu dnes kameru, protože jsem v místě, kde nemám připojení přes Wi-Fi a jedu opravdu jenom přes hotspot, takže by mi to úplně spadlo, i tak je to nestabilní, takže se omlouvám. Všechny zdravím, jak říkala Eva, jsem členem týmu projektu na podporu implementace odpovědného veřejného zadávání a vlastně největším mojím úkolem je zajištění toho institutu, jak obsahově, tak částečně i technicky. Takže přeji dneska hodně inspirace, taky se těším na seminář. Hezký den.
Super, děkuju. A doufám, že jsem na nikoho nezapomněla. Ještě máme připojeného Karla Tůmu, který nám také pomáhá vlastně i s naším webem a s naplňováním a během všech těch seminářů a nejsem si jistá, jestli teď zrovna bude se chtít připojit. A je-li někdo, na koho jsem vlastně v průběhu toho představování zapomněla a rád by se nám představil, což my bychom byli taky rádi, tak teď je ta šance, počkáme pár sekund. Pokud nikdo takový není, tak předávám slovo Shaunovi.
Okay, thank you very much, Ava. I'm really pleased that I asked you to do the introductions because I would have had no idea how to do the some of the names in Czech. So thank you very much for that. It's really interesting to hear that we've got a range of people on the call today. Some quite experienced and some with absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. So it will be an interesting session to go through. Really pleased to hear as well that some of you were at my workshop 2 years ago. I've worked with colleagues in the Czech Republic for many years now. It seems a bit weird to be doing it online from home rather than coming and enjoying your lovely country and your wonderful beer, but you know, it can't be helped. The coronavirus is with us for some time, I think. So as Ava mentioned, yeah, really helpful if you can have your cameras on. Microphones on mute, but feel free to open up a discussion at any point during the session. So you can raise your hand on Zoom. Ava, if I would ask you and the team maybe to let me know if anybody's raised a hand, because I'm sharing a full screen, so I can't see raised hands. So if you have any questions or any comments during the session, please do just raise your hand and we'll talk about it. Or use the chat function in Zoom if you have questions or comments, as I say, in either language, because we are doing the simultaneous interpretation. I would like right at the beginning to thank the interpreters. Again, I've worked with you for quite a long time, and I don't know how you do your job. It's wonderful. And apologies if I speak too quickly, because as you know, I can get very passionate about this subject. So please do tell me if I'm talking too fast. Okay, what I'd like to do, I'm going to stop sharing again in a moment, because Ava mentioned in the introduction, and some of you mentioned the self-assessment that we asked you to try online, and hopefully some of you did. This self-assessment tool is on a website, iso2400.org. This is a website that my organization funds and operates through our social enterprise business. So the way that works is my trading business donates 2.5% of its revenue to the social enterprise, and the social enterprise has a mission to build the body of knowledge around the world on sustainable procurement. The self-assessment tool sits on that website. There's also a lot of really good resource and interesting articles and case studies, etc., in many different languages. We also run international webinars and put up recordings of those webinars, all in English at this moment in time. But I'm really hoping to be able to put up the recording of this webinar. Quite how we edit it in 2 languages, I'm not sure yet, but we'll give it a try. So I'm going to stop sharing again and really just open up the floor to you, to anybody that attempted the self-assessment. If you could maybe give the group some feedback, tell us how it went for you, what were the key points or learning points that you had from your self-assessment. It's perfectly okay to say we scored very low and we're at the beginning of the journey, or if you feel you've made some progress on the journey, it will be really interesting to hear from you. So I won't go around the room. I'll just ask anybody to speak if you feel you'd like to share your experience with doing the self-assessment. I will sit here in silence until somebody speaks to me.
Okay, so I'll just break the silence because it cannot be worse. So anybody who speaks after me will be better. So I'm just okay for this purpose. Because I have to admit that I didn't have the time to make the self-assessment. So I'm very sorry for it, and I will definitely do it as soon as we finish. So, but we do the public procurement in a socially or responsible way, but
I believe that we are speeding up as probably everybody else does. So please, anybody else free to speak.
Okay, thank you for breaking the silence. I knew somebody would eventually. The purpose of the self-assessment, some of you, many of you said you were at different points in your sustainable procurement journey. What the self-assessment can do is to give you an action plan. So if you go, it takes you through in 20 questions only. So it's not a detailed evaluation against the standard. It just gives you some idea of where you are and what your priorities might be if you want to align to the standard. And many of you have said either, you know, you kind of get the standard theoretically, but maybe haven't understood the practice. It really enables you, or some of you say that you do procure responsibly, and I'm sure you do. You're all public procurers. Why wouldn't you do that? I think what the standard does is it helps you to embed the consistency and also to help you think about priorities around sustainable procurement, because not every category of supply will do everything. So hopefully you'll enjoy the self-assessment and come back before the second session, and thank you. Does anybody else like to, anybody did the self-assessment would like to share? Or has nobody done the self-assessment? Are you as bad as English people at doing your homework? In which case we may have a problem, because I am going to set you an assignment at the end of today to do between now and the next session. Okay, I'll break the silence and we will move on. Okay, so back to the slides. My slides have stopped working. Okay, so this is what we're going to learn today. We're going to do some definitions, as I said, to understand what we mean when we talk about sustainability and sustainable procurement. Some of you seem to be quite experienced in this area, so forgive me if we go through things that you already know. I'd like to talk about drivers, about why you need to procure, why you should procure sustainably. Now I know that in the Czech Republic, of course, you have a law that tells you to do it, but really, what sits behind that? Why, as organisations, do you choose to procure sustainably? Because your why will drive your what. Sustainable procurement will mean different things for different organizations in the virtual room. So, you know, that there are people in the room that procure for municipalities, for major cities. There are people here from national government organizations, from universities, from hospitals. All of you will, each of you will have a different prospect of sustainability. You will think of things different. The sustainability priorities, for instance, for rural communities are very different than they are for city municipalities. Universities will have their own unique challenges. So I'd like to talk about the why and the what, and how you set standards and how you set your expectations to your supply chain. We will talk through the ISO 2400 in some detail to take you through the principles and how it works, and to understand at a high level some of the tools. And then, as I say, the second session will be going into asking you to pick some products or a product that you buy, and we'll take you through a procurement process and start to think about how you embed sustainability priorities. So that's what we're going to do. So sustainability today, what's it all about? I'm going to show you a short video, which I hope is going to run, and I hope, interpreters, you can translate it.
The concept of sustainability first appeared in the Brundtland Report, published in 1987. This document, which was also referred to as Our Common Future, was elaborated for the United Nations in order to warn about the negative environmental consequences of economic development and globalization. It was written with the aim of offering solutions to the problems arising from industrialization and population growth. Today, sustainability tries to secure present needs without compromising future generations. How? Without giving up any of the three essential pillars: environmental protection, social development, and economic growth. Sustainability is concerned with assuming that nature and the environment are not an inexhaustible resource, and so it is necessary to protect them and use them rationally. Sustainability promotes social development, seeking cohesion between communities and cultures to achieve satisfactory levels in quality of life, health, and education. Thirdly, sustainability focuses on equal economic growth that generates wealth for all without harming the environment. Nowadays, many of the challenges that humans face, such as climate change or water scarcity, can only be tackled from a global perspective and by promoting sustainable development. Now that you know what sustainability is, remember to act in the present, thinking about the future.
Okay, I hope that gave you a very broad definition of sustainability. I always find it quite interesting and shocking, I suppose, that the Brundtland Report was published in 1987 and was considering the impacts on the planet of population growth way back then. And I generally think we as a society, as governments and big corporations, have been very slow to understand those messages. But what I do see in the last year or two is a significant shift by governments and by corporations and businesses towards more sustainability. I think the world now is starting to get climate change and understand that it's a really significant threat. I think there's a lot more focus now around the world on social value, and more so driven by the pandemic, because clearly there are going to be people all around the world that have been affected by the COVID pandemic. Either their health has been affected, or due to the impacts on the economy, people's lives and livelihoods have been affected. And for the first time, certainly in my lifetime, the world has a common problem. We're all facing issues related to the COVID pandemic. So I think at the time of the global financial crisis, sustainability kind of went away for a little while because the whole emphasis was on economic recovery, and maybe people and the planet were forgotten for a little while. But I think things are changing. I think in the inevitable recession that the world will face after the COVID pandemic, I don't think sustainability will go away. So I think we're in the right place at the right time to be thinking about these things at this moment in time. So when we talk about sustainability, we talk about environmental, social, economic issues together, and they work together, in my opinion. I'm not quite sure how some words will translate into Czech, but I did hear through the interpreters the expression responsible procurement coming back, responsible public procurement. You'll also hear green public procurement and various other expressions. On the ISO committee, we decided on the words sustainable procurement because sustainable covers the widest possible definition of ethics, responsibility, social, environmental, economic, and all of those things. And procurement, in the opinion of the group, covered the widest definition of working with suppliers. So everything from defining a need through managing contracts, through end of life of contracts, the entire procurement cycle is covered by this standard, not just maybe the transactional buying bit in the middle. So important that we understand that what we're talking about here is a very broad set of definitions. You may also have heard of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It really expands on the original Brundtland report, and it is starting to become a common language and a common set of definitions that we can use across the world here. It's well worth a look. If you go on to the Sustainable Development Goals website, you'll see quite a lot of detail that sits underneath the 17 headings that you see here. And the idea is, of course, that not every organization would be able to do something to address all 17 goals. So you pick your priorities. This will be a theme throughout the whole 2 sessions that we're running today. We must prioritize as organizations, and we must prioritize our supply chains. We need to keep what we do around sustainable procurement relevant to our organization and relevant to our supply chains. So the sustainable development goals are a great guide. If you're really just starting on your sustainability journey, then they're a very good place to start. Okay, so that was all I'm going to say about sustainability in general. We are talking, as I say, about a very wide definition of the subject. I know many of you are already familiar with some of these concepts, so we won't dwell on it for too long. Now I'd like to talk about sustainable procurement as a specific subject, and I'm going to share another video with you, which was actually developed by the delegation from the Netherlands on the ISO 2400 standard, and I really like it. It's in English, thankfully not in Dutch, but I think it summarizes in a really short video what this is all about. And this video is openly available to anybody. It's on the ISO2400.org website. It's on YouTube. It's a nice simple video to use. I hope you like it.
Keeping the world livable for the generations to come. This is where procurement plays an essential role. ISO 2400 is the right way to do it. These international guidelines give organizations sustainable procurement policies, structure and insight. After the corporate sustainability policy has been established, it will be incorporated into procurement policy and strategy. Procurement will consider stakeholder needs, risks and priorities. It will factor in measurement of impact and achievement and will consider staff training requirements. These preconditions help purchasers, contract managers, and budgetary controllers embed sustainability in the procurement process. Think of the inclusion of social and environmental criteria, the choice for sustainable and innovative suppliers, the striving for circular procurement, and the agreement on codes of conduct. All these sustainability actions are continuously being monitored and improved. The results are then fed back to management and other stakeholders. The ISO 2400 guideline will support you and your organization when taking the steps required to keep procuring and doing business in a future-proof way. Start working with it too and visit our website.
Okay, I hope you found that video useful. This is the definition from the standard. We spent many days amongst 42 different nations in the ISO committee discussing this. So what is sustainable procurement? Procurement that has the most positive environmental, social and economic impacts on a whole life basis. There were lots of discussions among the committee about, when I first started doing sustainable procurement 20 years ago, I guess, it was all about risk. It was all about what can go wrong. It was all about trying to eliminate the worst aspects of things that we procure. So I, for one, was very determined to make the ISO standard a positive message. It's how can we do better for environmental, social and economic impacts. Just doing things less bad is no longer good enough. So I think that's a very key message to take away from the standard and from what we discussed today. What we're trying to do with our procurement is to improve things. I think that's we will talk about risk as we go through today's session and the following session, but it's about how we can deliver positive impacts through what we procure. So the ISO 2400 guidance standard, I know that Ava has issued a copy of the standard, I think, to you, and also a Czech translation of the guide that I wrote when the standard was first published, which I hope you found useful. The standard itself is not an easy read, it's quite a long document, and I wrote a guide, I think, in something like 8 pages, which I think helps. It's important to recognize that ISO 2400 is a guidance standard and not a requirement standard. So it's not like, say, ISO 14001 or 9001, where you can have an audit and get a certificate to show that you've complied. It's much more guidance along a journey. It is possible, of course, to have an independent evaluation of your practice against the standard and some recommendations. My organization does that, and many others do as well. But it's not a certificate on the wall type of standard. And people ask me sometimes when it will grow up and become a proper standard that you can be certified against. I, for one, hope it never does, because for me, if you have an audit against the standard, it's a competition between how good you are at hiding the bad stuff and how good the auditor is at finding it. I much prefer to go into a client to say, look, show me everything you've got, honestly. And then I can really evaluate what you're doing against the standard, and I can make some recommendations for how to do better. So for me, a guidance standard is a better way of doing things. Of course, it doesn't replace any legislation, it doesn't replace any procurement rules, but it is perfectly possible under the EU procurement rules to deliver sustainable procurement. We've been doing it in the UK for many years, up until the 1st of January this year when we left the EU, and the public procurement rules will change. But nonetheless, the principles of fairness and transparency embedded into the EU rules, it is perfectly possible to incorporate sustainability requirements into those standards. So this is the structure of the document. It comes in 4 sections, and we will follow those 4 sections as we go through today.
Check.
Okay, somebody got a question? I got a voice on the line there. Okay, I'll carry on. So the fundamentals, how, why, what are the principles of the organization? How does that maybe, as a public body, how does that tie into public policy? We'll talk about policy and strategy. How do you set out at a high level your requirements to your supply chains? what I call the enablers, although in the standard it's called organizing the procurement function towards sustainability. These are all of the organizational elements that you need to put in place in order to deliver sustainable procurement. And then finally, the procurement process itself. We'll be covering the first 3 sections this morning, and then we'll go into the procurement process in more detail in the second session. So, fundamentals. These are the fundamentals from the standard. So the standard talks about managing risk at a high level. It talks about due diligence. So having a real understanding of your supply chain and taking responsibility as the procurer at the top of the value chain for what happens through the various tiers of the supply chain. It talks about setting priorities, and this is a theme all the way through the standard. Prioritize, prioritize, prioritize. You really need to understand where your organization can make the most positive difference and where the organizations in your supply chain can help you to make that difference. Avoiding complicity. This is an interesting one. In the UK for I think about 4 or 5 years now, we've had a Modern Slavery Act. And what that says basically is if you procure something and there is modern examples of modern slavery in any tier of your supply chain, then you are deemed to be complicit. You are responsible for what you buy. It's not possible to say, I gave a contract to a supplier, the supplier gave it to a sub-supplier, and the sub-supplier gave it to another supplier, and there were some people employed in that sub-supplier in some really awful conditions, maybe forced labor, child labor, whatever. You can't say under the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, this was not my fault. Similar legislation is coming in the EU. Australia has a Modern Slavery Act, California, South Africa. This is something that's coming around the world. And then finally, exercising influence. As a purchaser, you have power. You can influence your supply chain to do things in a better way. If you have a lot of power, you can make a big influence. If you have less power, then you would be what I call a market taker. So for example, if I'm buying IT equipment, the IT industry still annoys me quite a lot because IT hardware often comes in an awful lot of packaging, some of it very unsustainable. But you won't be able to influence the packaging policies of Hewlett-Packard or Dell or Toshiba or Apple. You can only buy the best option that's available to you. But in some cases, and I'll maybe talk about some examples later, if you have big purchasing power, you can have a big influence on your supply chain. So, moving on to drivers. This is why, as an organization, you feel you need to be sustainable. And it's a very important concept for me. It's something that I've been doing with organizations now for many years. And I was very determined to get this principle embedded into the standard. Because, as I said, your why will drive your what. So if, for instance, I'll go through the drivers here. So the first one is about customer. So responding to the expectations of your customers. Some of the organizations in the room will have customers as public bodies. Maybe that's less important to you. Competitive advantage. Businesses obviously compete, but then so do some public bodies. So do universities, for example. Innovation. Are you driven to be sustainable, to seek innovation in your supply chain, to find more responsible, sustainable products and services? Stakeholder expectations, the government departments that you're accountable to, maybe. It could be local stakeholders, those of you that are buying on behalf of municipalities, the local population, the electorate. It could be non-government organizations that are pressurizing you to do things. Legislation. What legislation do you need to comply with, and how strongly are you driven by that? Public policy. We have pretty much all public procurers in the room, so public policy is driving you very hard, I imagine. Risk management. It is important, as I say, I talk about positive impacts a lot, but understanding what can go wrong in your supply chain and how bad it might get is very important. Security of supply chain. We've all seen, as a result of the COVID pandemic, disruptions to our supply chain. How strongly driven are you by that? Investor confidence. This is probably more of a private sector thing, but institutional investors are looking more and more and more at sustainability, climate change, human rights, and some of those issues. Workers. By being sustainable, can you attract and retain better people? By being sustainable, can you attract more supplier commitment? So are your suppliers more likely to favor your business if you're setting out a sustainability agenda? Cost. Of course, you can reduce costs by being more sustainable. And we heard earlier about circular procurement, another expression, but the circular economy can drive costs down. Using less energy, using fewer resources, wasting less will drive your costs down. The other thing to remember as well is the most sustainable thing you will ever buy and the lowest cost thing you will ever buy will be something you don't buy at all. So challenging the need. Do you really need to procure at all? Can you do things in a different way? Can you reorganize the way that you do things? Can you reuse something that you already have? Do you need to procure? Very important. Economic value creation, so that's looking at the benefits to wider society and communities in your organization. Personal leadership is the person or people at the very top of your organization driving this with a passion. And finally, organizational ethics, the fundamental values of your organization. How are these things driving you? Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to get very courageous and try and do a group exercise. So Ava, I think, has sent out some translations of the exercise, so it's completely clear to you for those of you who don't speak English fluently. So we're going to send you away into your groups to spend, let's say, 10 minutes. So if we can set the Zoom thing to bring everybody back in 10 minutes, to talk amongst your groups about your drivers. So looking at that selection there, what things are driving you most specifically? What are your priority drivers as an organization? And then when we come back, I'll go through the groups and I'll ask each group to give some feedback. So please do elect somebody to speak, again, in either language when you come back after 10 minutes. Hello, I think everybody's coming back now. I think you're all back into the main room, hopefully. So I hope that works for you technically. What I'd like to do is just to go around the groups and ask one person from each group just to try and summarize what you discussed in your groups around drivers, what you think is driving your organizations, or anything else that you'd like to talk to me about. So can I start with group one, if you can remember who's in group one?
to na našich stranách jako ty mezinárodní korporaci, tak jako pracovníci jsou vychází, ale jako zase klidně řekněte někdo, co myslíte vy. Já jako taky bych to viděl prostě pracovníci 4 možná.
Aha, já myslím, že někdo ještě dokončuje ty svoje diskuze a Shaun už prosil skupinu číslo 1. Jestli si pamatujete, kdo jste měli na obrazovce, že jste ve skupině číslo 1. Jestli byste shrnuli, co jsou vaše hybné síly, proč se chcete nebo pouštíte do odpovědného nakupování. A my teďka nevíme přesně, kdo byl ve skupině číslo 1, jak to pan Jiří z Pozitivu rozdělil. Tak dobrovolně se někdo přihlašte.
Já se hlásím. My jsme to řešili s kolegyní Kukijovou, pokud se nemýlím, to jméno. A poměrně jsme se shodli v tom, co ty naše hnací síly nejintenzivnější jsou, a shodli jsme se v podstatě i v tom, co nejsou, nebo které z nich to nejsou. Hodně, samozřejmě kromě toho, že to teda teď máme 3 týdny v zákoně, tak to jakoby pomíjíme, ale pro nás silnou hybnou silou je etika organizace, protože vnímáme, že se naše organizace snaží být odpovědné ve spoustě oblastí a my se to vlastně snažíme promítnout do té oblasti veřejného zadávání a veřejných nákupů. Hodně silné hnací síly jsou pro nás ty ekonomické. Optimalizace nákladů, tvorba ekonomické hodnoty, náklady životního cyklu. A to se nám vlastně promísí nebo míchá s optimálním využíváním zdrojů, právě třeba s cirkulárním zadáváním, se snižováním dopadů na životní prostředí. A třetí takový okruh, který vnímáme jako důležitou hnací sílu, je dodavatelský řetězec. Vlastně jeho fungování, dobré vztahy v rámci dodavatelského řetězce, podpora férových poddodavatelských vztahů, tak aby právě třeba i v té dnešní složité situaci prostě plnění zakázek probíhalo tak jak potřebujeme. No a když se na to podívám z té druhé strany, tak jsme se vlastně shodli, že nevnímáme nějaký tlak, nebo tou hnací silou není očekávání zainteresovaných stran, primárně třeba politiků nebo vlastně vedení těch organizací, kde my se spíš snažíme tu podporu nějak získávat, nějak o ní bojovat, ale ta iniciativa k tomu odpovědnému přístupu přichází spíš ze spoda, od nás jakoby běžných pracovníků a není vyžadována ze strany vedení. A stejně tak vnímáme, že není vyžadována ani ze strany zákazníků, klientů, pro které vlastně třeba ty veřejné nákupy organizujeme, pro které něco pořizujeme. Takže tolik asi za naši skupinu.
Souhlas.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting and useful. A useful summary. Yeah, understanding what your drivers are and as you said, what your drivers are not is really important. It's interesting to hear that you don't necessarily have big stakeholder expectations driving you. That's not always the case in other countries. For instance, I think we're seeing a lot of stakeholder expectation here in the UK, maybe other countries like France. Certainly we do a lot of work in places like Australia, but it is what it is. This is why it's very important for you to think about these drivers, and then, as you say, if your drivers are primarily economic, then those are the expectations that you will set of your supply chain. So, yes, thank you for that, Jakob. That was a really good summary and reflects the principles of the standard really well. I think what I'm going to do in the interest of time, because there are a lot of groups, for this exercise, I'm going to ask half of the groups to feedback. And then in the next exercise, I'll ask the other half to feedback. So if we can go to group 3, please. Coming group 3. Anybody from group 3 want to talk to me?
Oh, I think nobody knows the his or her number.
Ava, would you like to go through the list of people that are in group 3?
I'm not.
I can share the spreadsheet. Is probably the best way.
Já si nejsem jistá, jestli my jsme to museli předělat v podstatě oproti tomu seznamu. Tohle já vlastně mám a nevím, jestli nám to pomůže. Dobrá, tak ze skupiny...
Okay, I can see I'm number 3.
Okay.
So I will...
Let's just ask anybody from any old groups of feedback then.
So let's make it quickly.
Thank you.
I think we agreed that we don't see any or almost any drivers in the investor group or investor confidence. We don't see any driver in competitive advantage, in stakeholder expectations. And on the other hand, we all agreed that probably the biggest driver now is the legislation.
Yeah.
And that's our primary driver today. And besides legislation, we agreed on the cost factors, life cycle thinking and cost optimization, economic value creation. That was really strong driver for all the companies in our group. And the last information, we realized that we can't agree on innovation. For 3 of us, it wasn't a really big driver, but for one company, it was one of the biggest. That's for all 4 group 3.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Again, it's another example. If your drivers are economic, then the sort of sustainability standards that you'll be setting will be around resource efficiency, energy use. If you have economic drivers, I think in the previous group, the wider economic impact was mentioned. So how can you procure locally? How can you procure in a way that provides jobs for people, maybe previously unemployed, etc. So it gives you a flavor of how you use drivers to set your targets. I'm really interested to hear that. I mean, obviously, as public bodies, you won't have investor confidence, you won't have competition as a driver, but interesting to understand that your suppliers will have, so that they'll be driven by different things to you, and how you work those through a supplier relationship management process is an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so can I ask for one more group then to volunteer? Any old group, I don't care.
Už vidíme to rozložení skupin, a tak já bych pozvala skupinu číslo 5, ať máme ta lichá čísla. A tam byla Petra Kopová, Marie Janečková, Natálie Štěpánková, Veronika Pijáčková a Zdeněk Cvejn. Tak kdo z vás bude mluvčím?
Tak dobrý den, Zdeněk Cvejn. Skupina vylosovala mě. Tak my jsme se ve skupině, protože jsme tam většinou zástupci univerzit, tak jsme se shodli na tom, že pro nás vlastně nejvýznamnějším hybnou silou byl ten osobní leadership, to, kde to vycházelo vlastně kde naše hybná síla nebo ta motivace vycházela hlavně z toho, jak to vnímalo to zakázkové nebo investiční oddělení, které přišlo s tím námětem přišlo s tou ideou a pokoušelo se oslovit vedení, že toto je cesta, kterou bychom se chtěli ubírat, prostě protože to vnímáme tak, že takto bychom chtěli nakupovat a takto by nákupy univerzit měly vypadat. Ono se to zároveň setkalo s tím, že v tu relevantní dobu byla poptávka našich zákazníků, pokud za zákazníky můžeme považovat studenty vysokých škol, kteří opravdu vnímají velmi silně tu udržitelnost a vystupovali poměrně aktivně v tom směru, že by se univerzity měly té udržitelnosti jak ve výuce, tak ve vlastním chování věnovat podstatně intenzivněji. To byl vlastně pohled, ty náměty od nás jako od pracovníků ze spoda a zároveň tlak od našich zákazníků, tedy studentů, že i naše vedení to vnímalo velmi silně jako věc, které je potřeba se věnovat a kterou má smysl rozpracovávat. Takže to byly ty naše základní hybné síly, které vlastně spustily ten přístup k odpovědnému zadávání u univerzit. Asi legislativa, která nám do toho v současné době vstoupila, na jednu stranu posiluje některé tendence a ty hybné síly, ale zároveň působí i určitým způsobem negativně, protože to, jak je ta legislativa nastavená, není, řekněme, z hlediska toho aktivního přístupu lidí, kteří to vedli, tak to není úplně šťastné. Tak tolik asi za skupinu univerzit, za skupinu číslo 5.
Já do toho vstoupím, děkuju. Já jenom bych chtěla takovou technickou poznámku pro paní tlumočnice, že nebyl přepnutý kanál čeština-angličtina a Shaun chvíli neslyšel, co pan Cvein říká anglicky. A vlastně i takový message Shaunovi, kanál angličtiny by měl fungovat jako na poslouchání angličtiny a kanál češtiny na češtinu. Jenom prosím paní tlumočnice, aby si to přepínali, aby Shaun všechno slyšel. To bude asi nejlepší, aby nemusel poslouchat ten český kanál. A předávám slovo Shaunovi a omlouvám se za tuto technickou vsuvku.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm getting the English translations back now. I had to switch to the Czech channel for a moment for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. But anyway, yes, thank you for resolving that for us. And sorry, I didn't quite get that whole translation. Okay, so I'm going to share again very briefly and take you to the next exercise actually. So the next thing to think about then, so we thought about drivers, and now we think about policy and strategy. A lot of you have spoken about legislation and policy being among your primary drivers. So what I'd like to do now is to put you back into your groups to continue the conversation and start to think about the sustainability policies that you're aware of within your organizations and how do they influence your job. So we're going into the next level of detail now to understand what's into the detail of actually if you're driven by certain aspects such as policy and legislation, what is that telling you to do with your supply chain? What should you be asking for from your supply chain and what should you be doing differently in your jobs? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now again. And if I can ask you to go back into your groups, we'll send you back into your groups for 10 minutes, please. And then we'll get some feedback from maybe some groups that didn't speak in the first session. Now we have everybody back. Okay, the wonders of technology. Welcome back to the main group, everybody. I said that a couple of minutes ago, but not everybody was back. So Ava, would you like to pick a group, as I seem to have miserably failed to do that last time? So some groups that we haven't heard of from before, maybe to give us some feedback on that session, please.
Skupina číslo 2, v které byla Dita Ohnoutková, Eva Grigorová, Jakub Prašívka, Radka Škubalová a Věra Havlová. Tak prosím někoho, aby se ujal slova.
Tak možná Eva Grigorová z magistrátu města Brna, která je absolutním nováčkem v odpovědném zadávání, ale protože se nikdo nepřihlásil, tak já se toho ujmu. Vlastně my jsme hovořili o tom, že velmi často je to věc osobní statečnosti a osobní odvahy a přístupu a nadšení, nebo alespoň doposud tomu tak bylo, kdy velmi často politik nebo starosta, který vlastně by to měl nějakým způsobem zastřešovat, tak řekne ano, já vám fandím, máte v tom zelenou, ale vlastně chybí nějaká jakoby komplexnější strategie, která by dávala podporu těm jednotlivým pracovníkům. Jistou výjimku v této naší skupině tvoří Jihomoravský kraj, krajský úřad Jihomoravského kraje, který má už vypracovanou výbornou strategii odpovědného zadávání. Tady mě určitě kolegyně pak třeba můžou doplnit. A vlastně taky se mi zdá, že je to lépe ošetřeno tam, kde existuje nějaký společný odbor nebo pracoviště, které se zabývá odpovědným nebo zadáváním veřejných zakázek pro vlastně celou tu instituci. Tam, kde si to jednotlivá pracoviště jako administrují sami, tak tam je ten přístup velmi roztříštěný. Tak to je asi takové shrnutí. A budu ráda, když mě kolegové z mé skupiny třeba ještě doplní.
Jestli můžu, tak já vděčím doplním. Jak už jsem říkala, i v naší skupině my máme v naší směrnici od loňského září zahrnuto i odpovědné zadávání, daleko dřív teda, než vznikla novela zákona. Ale pořád je to všechno o těch politicích. Jak jsem říkala, ve skupině nám se vyměnilo politické vedení a je to strašně moc znát v tom přístupu k tomu zadávání. Některé ty podmínky, které tam dáváme, jak říkám, já mám ráda i v té fázi hodnotících kritérií, tak nejsou zcela úplně pochopeny a berou to v podstatě jako obtěžování i těch uchazečů. Takže je to opravdu o strašně dlouhém vysvětlování a mnohdy hodně náročném, když už jsou ochotní přistoupit na to, že ten náš požadavek má smysl, tak naopak chtějí do maximálních hodnot. Tak se zase snažíme vysvětlovat, že se musí v pomalých krůčkách, že nemůžeme jako opravdu dát, já nevím, že vozový park celý se bude skládat z ekologických vozidel, ale že musíme prostě postupně na to připravovat ty účastníky. Takže za mě je to určitě, strategie je fajn, ale nezmůže všechno. Je potřeba, aby tam byla spřízněná duše, která má tu moc a má prostě tu páku i na ty své kolegy, aby dokázala prosadit ten požadavek, který je určitě oprávněný. Tak to je za mě.
Děkujeme a teď přichází na řadu další skupina a tou je ta, které jsem byla i já součástí. Měli jsme tam Dagmar Millerovou Práškovou, Hanu Dostálovou, Lenku Holerovou a Janu Vokřálovou a bude za nás mluvit Lenka Holerová.
Lenka Holerová, město Jičín. My jsme byli poměrně taková různorodá skupina. Nicméně musím říci, že v takových těch hlavních parametrech jsme se asi shodli A musím teda ještě i potvrdit slova té skupiny, která teď hovořila přede mnou, že ano, na jednu stranu jsou tady strategie, které jsou propsány v dokumentech, ať už se bavíme o směrnicích nebo strategických plánech, nebo možná i nějakých kodexech, které ty organizace máme, ale je to také o přístupu nás všech jakoby zaměstnanců těch organizací, o tom přístupu k tomu odpovědnému veřejnému zadávání, jak se vůbec chováme, protože konkrétně v našem případě to město, ta radnice na tom městě jakousi vlajkovou lodí, která měla být příkladem všem ostatním. Takže nemělo by to být jenom třeba o tom vedení, ale mělo by to být o nás všech. Shodli jsme se, že hrozně záleží na tom, jak se chováme a jak přistupujeme k nákupům, ať už formou objednávek, zakázek, malých, velkých, protože to naše chování může mít vlastně vliv třeba i na druhé straně zeměkoule. Shodli jsme se také všichni, že podporujeme především férové dodavatelské vztahy v tom řetězci. Shodli jsme se, že určitě chceme bezpečné pracovní podmínky u dodavatelů a třeba konkrétně u nás ve městě se ještě zaměřujeme na podporu technického vzdělávání dětí a chceme jim právě ukazovat, že to není vůbec špatná věc mít technické vzdělání na jakékoliv úrovni, ať už od těch řemeslných oborů, které prostě, myslím si, že jsme všichni na tom stejně, že je obrovský nedostatek u nás v republice, řemeslníků obecně, ale i dalších technických oborů, ať už se to týká bezpečnosti práce, stavebních oborů, strojařských oborů a tak. Takže jenom když to shrnu, tak jsme se opravdu všichni z té skupiny, byť jsme hodně různorodí, nejsme z homogenní skupiny, ale shodli jsme se, že je důležité být tím příkladem, tím správným pozitivním příkladem, který je pak hoden následování.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and I was really gratified to hear a lot of what you were saying, because my next piece is going to talk about leadership and accountability. So I'm going to share my screen again briefly. Okay, so one of the first things that the standard identifies is the need for leadership and accountability, which is something that that many of you have fed back from the group. So thank you for that. It is very important that top management are driving this. It's not impossible to do sustainable procurement if they're not, because sometimes they don't. But the standard really recognizes the importance of leadership at the top level of an organization, not just signing off a policy. I was working with a client in the UK last year, and they said, "Oh yeah, we're doing really well for leadership. Yeah, that's because our chief executive has signed the policy." Well, that's okay, but does your chief executive talk about the policy when he's talking to your staff, to your customers, to your shareholders, to your political leaders? So very important that you have that leadership, and also political leadership was mentioned, and that of course is difficult, because we all know that politicians come and go in a democratic society, and sometimes they have different policies, but it's very important to have that leadership from the top. And I am seeing improvements around the world now in the way that things are led. Then there's the management of procurement itself. So there needs to be accountabilities for sustainable procurement within that structure. And then there are the individuals responsible for procurement. But then when we were developing the standard in the very early days of the development of the standard, we had a big discussion, and I had a big argument with the representative from Denmark about who this standard is for, because in his opinion, the standard is for procurement officers. In my opinion, the standard is for anybody in an organization who participates in procurement decisions or works with suppliers. And that's probably most people. So this is not, for me, just a procurement department thing. And we'll talk about stakeholders as we go through the session today. Lots of examples here. To be honest, mostly from private sector organizations on the screen, of leadership around the world. So organizations that are embracing this agenda and saying we will lead. And interesting to hear the feedback from the group saying, you know, as a municipality, as a government body, we should set an example. So that's very much about leadership, pushing the agenda forward. It's very important, what I call the golden thread. So that the link between the policy at the top of the organization through the procurement strategy into the actual processes that we run with our supply chains. There should be visibility all the way up and down the value chain of your policy priorities. Okay, what I suggest we do, we've been going for 2 hours now. I guess you could probably do with a break. So I suggest if we can break for 10 minutes and return in 10 minutes time. So if you can switch your cameras off and go on mute, but then when you return, if you can put your cameras back on again, so I know you're back, and then we'll continue with the session. But let's stretch our legs and have a cup of coffee. I certainly need one for 10 minutes, please. Thank you. Okay, I see a few faces appearing on cameras. I hope you come back refreshed, and thank you very much for coming back. It's always a bit disheartening when people disappear when you let them go away for a break. So I'm going to share my screen again now, and we'll carry on with the session. So we've talked about drivers, we've talked about some examples of policies that your organizations may have, and the next important step in the standard then is to set out that policy in some way that makes it clear to your stakeholders, to your staff, to your supply chains. And there are many examples here on the screen in front of you of policy documents that organizations produce. It's very important to do this at a very early stage, because it's important to signal to your supply chain your expectations. This for me is absolutely fundamental, because supply chains do not like surprises. If you suddenly include something new in a tender or in the way in which you're interacting with your suppliers, something that they don't expect, there's a very good chance that what they will do is increase the price, simply because they don't understand and they weren't expecting you to come up with a requirement. And that perpetuates the myth that sustainability costs more. It should not cost more. Bad procurement will cost you more. So communicating at an early stage with your supply chain and your potential suppliers is a very strong recommendation from my perspective. What I'm going to do now is just to illustrate an example. Some of you said you'd like to see practical examples. So I'm taking you to another website. We mentioned earlier the supply chain school in the UK. So this is the website of the school. It's all in English. Apologies for those non-English speakers, but I will explain what I'm trying to illustrate. So the school has many partners that fund it and participate in it, both public and private sector organisations. And here's the partner wall, as we call it, of those organisations that contribute both financially and contribute to the priorities and the direction of the school. I'm going to pick Grosvenor. This is an organisation that I know very well. They are in the private sector, but it is a relevant example for you. They're a very large property business in the UK and in other parts of the world. And we've helped Grosvenor for many years as consultants around their sustainable procurement agenda. So here's Grosvenor's page on the website. It makes reference to their business and to their sustainable procurement charter. What we've been able to do then is to create a learning pathway uniquely for Grosvenor. So here they have what they call their supply chain charter, which is the standards that they expect of their supply chain. We also made a video for them to explain a little more of what the charter is. So if I'm on the supply chain school, I can go forward to read the charter. A very beautifully crafted document, but it doesn't have to be. It can be very simple and straightforward. A little bit about the organization, and then some statements around what they expect from their suppliers. Also, how those suppliers are supported. So there are various organizations here that can provide knowledge, resources, support for that supply chain to do things differently. It's very important that that happens, I think. So they've set out the resources that are available to the suppliers, and then they go into what their commitments are. So in this case, health, safety, and well-being. And the structure of the document is where they set out their standard requirements. So these are the minimum things that we would expect from our supply chain as a condition of doing business with us. And then they set out what they call advanced expectations. So where they want to work with their suppliers to achieve a goal that maybe isn't there today and maybe isn't something that they know how to achieve. So, for example, a lot of organizations now are setting net zero carbon targets. In the UK, the government has set targets net zero by 2050. Some organizations are setting net zero targets earlier than that. And they don't know how they're going to achieve that, but they're setting that out. They're putting it out there to their supply chain saying, we want to achieve this. We want to work with you in order to achieve it. So just to scroll through the document a little more, creating a responsible payment culture. So this is about paying suppliers on time and expecting suppliers to pay their suppliers on time. Ethical conduct is important to this organization. Community participation, materials, which brings in a lot of circular economy principles that we mentioned earlier. Valuing nature is another one that, again, this organization is very interested in. Waste management. And in each case, against each of the headings, there's a little about what the organization wants to achieve and what they expect their supply chain to do to support them. So I hope you found that useful as an example of what a policy and strategy document might look like. What we've been able to do then in the supply chain school is to take each of those policy commitments and attach some learning. So a supplier can come onto this site and say, okay, I work for Grosvenor, or I want to work for Grosvenor. I want to comply with their ethical conduct policy, by way of example. So then here's some information about the Bribery Act. So that's some legislation in the UK. Here's an e-learning module on ethical business. And here's some information about cybersecurity as an example. Fair employment conditions. Here are some e-learning modules that you can take so you can understand more about this subject. So very important, that you set your expectations to your supply chain at a high level that drives everything else that you do, and that you support your people and your supply chain in doing so. Understanding your supply chain. Many organizations know very little about their supply chains beyond tier 1. And if you don't understand where the value is in the supply chain, it's very difficult to achieve best value for money, and it's very difficult to understand where the risks are. So the diagram on the right hand side is a diagram directly copied from the standard, and it talks about developing a sourcing strategy for anything, for goods, services, etc. So first of all, what we will see on the top block there is assessing the sustainability risks and opportunities. So what are the sustainability impacts for this product? So if I were to take some examples, if I were buying air conditioning equipment, I'd be very interested in climate change, in the energy efficiency of a piece of equipment, and I may use whole life cost techniques to evaluate that efficiency. I'd be very interested in circular economy, in what happens to that piece of equipment at the end of its life, as an example. So I might be interested in the recycled content, what the air conditioning equipment is made from. Can it be made from recycled materials? If I were a public body, say, buying services, I might be buying, say, outsourced care services for elderly people. The sustainability impacts, risks and opportunities are very different. So there I would be looking at social value. I'd be looking for an organization that has good relationships with the community. I'd be looking for an organization that's maybe employing local people, previously unemployed people, because this is a service that people provide. So I can generate some benefit to the economy locally. Then the next 3 blocks are things that you probably do anyway as procurement professionals. I start to understand the costs, the organizational needs, what actually is required from this procurement, and then to understand what market is out there, what sort of supply chain I have to provide me with this product, whatever it might be. So it's simply incorporating sustainability objectives into what you do anyway. The next piece then, in terms of managing implementation, is all about turning those expectations into smart goals. So really understanding how I can interpret a requirement into a procurement specification, making sure that I've got very clear roles and responsibilities. As procurement professionals, we rarely work alone. We work with budget holders, we work with the part of the organization that will ultimately use the goods or services that we supply, and we work with our suppliers as well. So really starting to understand, if I'm going to, I'll run with my examples of a piece of air conditioning equipment. So I'm buying air conditioning equipment. I can either ask a supplier to declare, for instance, the recycled content of a piece of equipment, or if I know the market well and I know what's available, I can simply say, I expect that product to be 30%, 50% recycled materials, because I know there are suppliers out there that can deliver that. And if I write it into the specification, then I evaluate the procurement in the way that I always would, because it's part of the requirement. If I know less about recycled content of air conditioning equipment, I can ask the supplier for the recycled content figures, and I can include it as part of my evaluation. I can ask the supplier for the energy consumption of the piece of equipment. I can ask the supplier how that equipment should be maintained and what the costs are. And I can ask the supplier what happens to the piece of equipment at the end of its life. Can I return it to the supplier? Can I recycle it? Can I reuse it, etc.? And I can do a whole life cost evaluation for that. So I can look at how long I would have that piece of equipment for. Say I'm going to have it for 10 years. So I can look at the energy component of the cost. I can look at the maintenance component and the cost of disposing the equipment at the end of its life, and evaluate my tender on the basis of whole life costs. If I'm buying services, I said care services for the elderly, say, I can set some care related objectives. So I can set some care quality objectives for the service. I can also, again, I could specify, for instance, the number of formerly unemployed people I would like to be employed, or I can ask the supplier for their policies and strategies around that and to evaluate their responses. So we can use different procurement techniques to manage the implementation of our procurement. Okay, so I'm going to move on now and talk about the enablers. So we've already covered the fundamentals and the policy and strategy, and now I'm going to take you into the sort of organizational conditions that we need to create in order to deliver sustainable procurement. So when we talk about organization conditions, we talk about governance, we talk about people, we talk about measurement, we talk about prioritization, engagement, and a grievance mechanism, how suppliers can feedback and maybe complain if they see something that's not happening appropriately in our supply chains. Okay, so let me talk about these individual sections. Sorry, I thought I had some more slides there. So if I talk about governance, what happens in an organization in terms of how you govern your procurement function? So if you have a set of rules and procedures around procurement, how do we incorporate sustainability into those? So that may be about the way that we review the performance of our procurement function. So we would normally look at, for instance, cost savings. Have I delivered cost savings? I might be looking at the performance of my suppliers in terms of delivery on time. For example, I might be looking at the process of procurement itself, the time difference between a request for supply and placing a contract. For example, I might be looking at the productivity of my procurement function and how many people are employed at what level, and how does that relate to the amount of procurement that's going through my organization. I would recommend then adding to that and starting to think about, within the governance structure of an organization, the sustainability impacts. So carbon footprint. How many contracts have I let on a whole life cost basis, by way of example? How many contracts have sustainability performance indicators? If I've got some objectives around sustainable procurement, some of the social impacts, then what's the value of that social impact to my procurement? So this could be anything from people that are being trained in the supply chain, people that are seeking new qualifications, maybe people that were previously unemployed, or people that come from disadvantaged backgrounds coming into the supply chain of our organization. So when we think about governance, those are the sorts of issues that we think about. When we think about people, we think about the certainly initially the procurement team. So what training have they been given? What training are they provided with? But also what support do they have? So in my very long experience in procurement, I find that a procurement professional usually isn't an expert in anything other than procurement. And we tend to be integrators of experts from other functions. So if I were to take an example, if I think about my people strategy, how are my people in the organization being supported? What are they doing to get some support from other parts of the organization? Sorry, I'm fiddling with my slides because I do have some other slides, and for some reason the slides sort of took it to the wrong place. So I'm just going to find the correct slide here rather than just talking. Okay, that's better. So if I was procuring a piece of technical engineered equipment, I would need some engineering technical people to support me in that. If I'm letting a particularly complex contract, then maybe I need some legal representation. If I've got a very financially complex piece of procurement, say a private finance initiative or something like that for a hospital or a school or whatever, then I might need an accountant to help me with some of the financial evaluation. Equally, if I have a piece of procurement that is very impactful from a sustainability point of view, then maybe I need some help from sustainability experts. So it's very important that we don't expect our procurement professionals to know everything about everything, and that support is available. So on this slide are some suggestions around how we might do that. So professional qualifications are always good, tailored training like we have here. I know in the Czech Republic you've got a great initiative with your Academy for Sustainable Procurement. So participating in that, but also some of the softer aspects as well. So work shadowing, networking, job exchanges, those sorts of things can all be useful. So very important that we support our people. And as I said earlier, the standard is not just for the procurement team. It's for people who work with suppliers. Often organizations will have panels of senior management or experts that approve new contracts. Very important that those people are trained. I did a lot of work many years ago with Network Rail, which is the rail company in the UK that provides all of the rail train infrastructure. And I spent a lot of time training the people that approve procurement strategies and contracts to understand the sustainability impacts so they can review and challenge those procurements in the right way. So when you think about training and support for people, it's not just the procurement team. It can be a variety of different people. Engaging stakeholders. Now, many of you said in the sessions you don't see stakeholders as drivers. And if you don't, then this part of the standard may be less important to you. But I would still recommend that you consider it, because there are internal functions within your organization that you will need to engage with, and you possibly do already as procurement people. So that's the top management. It can be people who specify goods and services. It can be people, for instance, from human resources departments that are responsible for the social responsibility aspects of the work. It could be policymakers in organizations. It could be politicians in the case of public bodies. It's very important to consider your supply chain as a stakeholder. So setting procurement priorities without consulting with your supply chain is usually a very bad idea. because you'll often find that your supply chain can actually deliver more than you expect them to. Or indeed, it helps certainly if you can start to develop your requirements with your supply chain so there are no surprises. As I say, if you're working in a municipality, the community in that municipality is important. If you're working for a university, then the students are important. They're your stakeholders. Those are the people that come to the university. Trade unions, worker organizations, and in some cases, non-government organizations. So very important to have a structured approach to engaging stakeholders and not just doing it in isolation. Okay, I'm going to talk now about one of my favorite subjects, what I call heat mapping, what the standard calls setting priorities. And do listen to this bit, because this is the exercise that I'm going to send you when we've finished today's session. This is all about understanding the categories that you procure. So what is it you buy, broken down into key categories? So this could be, you know, if I look at construction as a major category, I buy some architects, some engineering consultants, I buy construction contractors, demolition contractors, I may buy some materials, so I may buy concrete, steel, plasterboard, timber, those sorts of materials. I may buy specialist subcontractors that maybe install air conditioning or that do building fit out. Break that down into its component parts. I may buy services, so I might buy catering services, I might buy courier services, logistics, I might buy citizen services for care in the community or whatever. Each of those categories of supply will have different sustainability impacts, and you can map them. You can take the headlines from your charter, your policy that I showed you earlier, and I can put the headlines across the top of my sheet, and my sustainability and my procurement categories down the side of my sheet, and I can put waste management, circular economy, carbon, employment opportunities, social value, modern slavery, risks in the supply chain, whatever my important priorities are for sustainability, and I can map them. It works like this. I start with my policy, which we've discussed. That policy will have a number of impacts, and my supply chain has a number of categories. So in this example, my policy divides down into environment, ethics, socio-economic and community, but it will be whatever your policy says. Then I have my spend categories. So here, this is a list of construction related categories, but it can be anything. Usually really good then to have a workshop, to get some people in a room or in a virtual room, as we do these days, with the people who have the knowledge of the categories that we buy. So that may be procurement people, or it may be specifiers, budget holders, technical people, and people that understand the sustainability impacts. So this could be people from an environment department, it could be people from policy, parts of a public organization. Bring them together and consider the inherent risks and impacts. So think about the relative magnitude of the impact. So if I'm buying, I don't know, stationery, and I think about carbon emissions related to stationery compared to the example that I used earlier, air conditioning equipment, which is very energy intensive, then the relative impact of stationery is less than air conditioning equipment. So air conditioning equipment priority is very much in carbon emissions, stationery possibly less so. and I can produce a matrix like this. So I color up the important impacts, the high impacts red, the medium impacts or impacts that I'm maybe not quite so sure about because I don't have enough information, I color them amber. And then finally, those low impacts, I color them green. What I can do then is all of my procurement can be based on that priority heat map. So when I'm buying a certain product, whatever it might be, I think about the category that it belongs to, and I address the red impacts. And the mantra should be every red, every procurement, every time. If you're really embedding sustainable procurement, everything that you do will address the red impacts for that category, not all of the impacts. And I get really frustrated when I see these mighty sustainability questionnaires that go out to suppliers, asking them a whole load of irrelevant questions that I'll probably never use to make a procurement decision. Which procurement techniques I use, we'll cover in a bit more detail in day 2. But for me, it's fundamental that the heart of your strategy needs to be a heat map, a priority heat map. In order to produce the heat map, you need to have a good policy where you're setting out your sustainability priorities as an organization, and you need a good idea of what categories of spend you have and how much money you're spending on each of those categories. If you don't have those things, then you can't really do a heat map. But it's a very good starting point, and it's something that I will ask you to practice when you go into your groups. And then you can have a plan for the category, and then you can set out your procurement processes, and then you can really start to deliver on sustainable procurement. Okay, now I'd like to talk about measuring performance. This is something that many organizations that procure do badly. There tends to be a culture of what I call let and forget. Like I've placed this contract, and now I'm going to move on to the requisition for the next contract and the next one and the next one. And I never go back to the first contract to see whether the supplier actually delivered what I asked for in the first place. So we have many reasons to do performance management. Possibly to satisfy our external stakeholders, our political leaders, our local stakeholders. Possibly it's something that the organization's top management is asking for. Certainly it's something the procurement function should be doing, and we should be looking at individual supplier performance, preferably during the course of a contract, so we can deal with issues as we go through that, as we go through the life of that contract. So, how? Important to establish the right language and the right terminology. These are the terminologies that we use in English. Whether they work in Czech, I'm not quite sure, but we'll give it a try. So we start off with, we talk about goals. So these are the overall goals that we expect to achieve. I want to reduce carbon emissions. I want to buy more products that have circular economy impacts. I want to buy more products and services that deliver social value, that maybe train more people, employ more local people, etc. So setting out the direction of travel that I want to take. So if I take a simple example, like waste management, so I want to reduce the amount of waste that I send to landfill, which means obviously increasing reuse, recycling, recovery of goods. The next expression I would use then is indicator. So how can I know that I'm making some progress towards my goal? Well, in this particular case, and it's a relatively simple example, waste to landfill, I need to understand the percentage of waste that's diverted from landfill from my contracts. Not from every contract, but clearly if I'm buying demolition, waste diverted from landfill is really important. If I'm buying facilities management services, say for a building or a series of buildings, then how much waste that contractor is sending away from the site is important, and how much of that is being diverted from landfill is important. So that's a percentage score. It's one number divided by another. Targets. So if I have good indication of what's possible, so maybe I can do some research, or I already have some baseline data on which to base my targets. I can say, okay, if I have a demolition contract, I want 80% of my waste to be diverted from landfill. So I can set that as a target and I can write it into a contract. If I don't have enough knowledge, I can simply collect the data to inform me about what waste is being diverted from landfill, and then I can set a target based on my baseline data. And then my final piece of language to share with you is metric. That's simply a number. So to get waste diverted from landfill, I need to know how many tons of waste are going away from my site, and I need to know how many tons are being diverted from landfill. And I divide one number by another and I get a percentage. There are more complex examples, particularly in some of the social value impacts that we can maybe discuss in day 2. But that's basically, how to set out performance management. It's quite simple, but it's very important that you do it before you let a contract. So you make it very clear in your tender documents that either if you already have a target that you feel you can legitimately set, you put it in the specification to say a condition of this contract is that you divert at least 80% of waste from landfill. Or if you don't have an idea of the target that you want to set, you can put it in the tender to say, as part of the tender response, we expect the supplier to state how much waste they would divert from landfill, and I can add a percentage of my evaluation scorecard to that tender. So I can, part of my procurement decision is how much waste goes away from landfill. Importantly, again, then, that if I establish that with my supplier, that I write it into the contract. So if the supplier the best supplier comes, the best overall supplier comes back and says, we commit to diverting 70% of waste from landfill, then put it in the contract, and put it in the contract that you would expect your supplier to report their performance regularly and for that performance to be auditable. It's really important to hold suppliers to account and to recognize at the very early stage of procurement that you are going to measure the supplier's performance in this area. So this is a slide really with the example. Sorry, does somebody have a question? No? Okay, I'll carry on. So this is the example written again in English. So the goal is reducing waste to landfill, resulting in environmental and cost benefits. A target, in this case, 90% waste diverted from landfill. The indicator is the percentage of waste diverted from landfill, and the metrics are the total waste generated and the total waste diverted from landfill to arrive at the indicator. And when we go into the practice session in day 2, I'll be asking you to think, when you start to think about something that you buy, how will you actually measure performance of your suppliers and your supply chain? Establishing a grievance mechanism. This is something that the Japanese delegation were very keen on when we established the standard. Having some mechanism whereby if anybody in your supply chain spots an issue, that they have a way of reporting it and the way that it's investigated, and those complaints are actually followed through and resolved. So this could be ethical practice. It could be examples, for instance, of bribery and corruption. It could be incidents of modern slavery or unethical labor practices. It could be issues related to conflict minerals, by way of example. So the standard recommends that there is some right of reply to the supply chain, so they can actually raise issues and concerns and complaints through a system whereby they can confidentially report back, and those complaints are evaluated, and there is some sort of resolution to those complaints. Okay, so this is taking me towards the end of the first session. We've covered quite a lot, and we've covered it in a little bit less time than we expected, so that's always good, to give you a bit of your day back. What I'm going to do now is to just try and summarize in very broad terms what we've talked about, and then I'll stop sharing, and I'm very happy then to take any questions or any comments or feedback, and also to talk to you about the exercise that I will ask you to do between now and the second session. So in summary, 3 hours in less than 3 minutes. Sustainability is a broad topic. It encompasses social, environmental, and economic impacts. And the important thing to remember is that it's a contextual topic. So sustainability will mean different things to different organizations in different parts of the country or different parts of the world. So it's very important that as an organization, you understand your sustainability priorities. And as I've said before, I know that we have people here from universities, from government departments, from municipalities. Those priorities will always be different. So understanding those priorities at the top level is really, really important. Then what I call the golden thread. So if, for instance, let's say you're procuring on behalf of a municipality in a rural community in the country, where issues such as poverty could well be an issue. Environmental impacts, the natural environment could be a significant issue for you. The climate change clearly may well be an important issue. If you're procuring for a university, by way of example, then probably climate change will be an issue as well. But you may be much more interested, as you're managing facilities and often quite complex facilities, you may well be very interested in waste management, in circular economy, certainly in energy consumption of the university building, and those types of issues. So very different priorities, but understanding from the top priorities of your organization, which are set in the context of that organization, who it serves, where it is, what community it's in, and how that flows down through your procurement policy and strategy, and then eventually into your priorities and goals within your organization. Sustainable procurement then, back to our definition. Procurement that has the most positive environmental, social, and economic impacts over the entire life cycle. So this starts to bring in life cycle analysis of goods, as we've spoken about in our air conditioning equipment example. It starts to bring in the social benefits of sustainability, particularly for services. If I'm buying waste management services, if I'm buying facility services, I might be buying some technical support, I might be buying IT related services. Those sorts of issues will have impacts on the way that people are employed. Are they being employed in an ethical way? Are we taking the maximum advantage of the opportunities to deliver economic benefit to the community? Business as usual. We're going to be running an online debate through the supply chain school in a couple of weeks' time with my friend and colleague Helen Carter, who some of you may remember. I know she came over and ran some workshops for you a few years ago. Sustainable procurement is good procurement. Discuss. We should be in a position eventually where sustainability is just something that we do. That, you know, I'm out of a job and there isn't a sustainable procurement department or function or person with responsibility for sustainable procurement in an organization, because it is just what we do. Sustainable procurement is good procurement. If you think about procurement practice and how it's done, and you think about, some of you said on the call that you don't just evaluate cost, you look at other factors of value and the way that you define value in your procurement, then sustainability should just be one of those value elements that you put into your procurement every day when you get up in the morning. And finally, then, I'll keep going on about prioritization, because I think it's so important. Very important that you prioritize sustainability impacts that are relevant to the category of supply that you're buying and are relevant to those suppliers that you're asking to supply to you. If you start to ask your supply chain for irrelevant objectives, your price will go up. And, you know, as most of you have said when we did the drivers exercise, cost and value are always going to be important factors. And as we go into the inevitable economic recession driven by the COVID crisis, it will become more important. But equally, trying to address some of the social impacts of the COVID-19 crisis will be important as well. Interestingly, the UK government, as of the 1st of January this year, has set a mandatory 10% evaluation criteria against social value. So all central government departments and government agencies are obliged to apply at least 10% in the evaluation criteria of their contracts. They've set out quite a clear definition of social value and what they expect. A number of public body organisations in the UK already do that, and I've certainly seen percentages as high as 20 or 40% allocated to social value in a procurement evaluation. This is partly as a result of the UK leaving the EU. Because the UK government now is a little freer to set its own objectives and isn't bound by the EU procurement rules. But this has had a shocking effect in the supply chain. I'm working with a client, an organisation called Serco, that provide government services all around the world. I don't think they supply in your part of the world, but all the jobs that governments don't want to do themselves, they give to an organisation like Serco. And they're in a blind panic about this requirement, because 10% will make a difference between them winning and losing a contract. Because prices usually are very close. So they're really striving to look at ways in which they can add value and the ways in which they can measure the social value that they're delivering in a contract. And it's I'm working with them as a consultant, and this is having a profound effect on that organization and the way that it operates. So don't underestimate your procurement power, particularly as a government body. If you set very high goals for your supply chain, they will respond and they will compete around it, and they can't put their prices up because they're in competition with other organizations that are competing not just around cost but also around sustainability. So you have the power as procurers to make a difference, and please use that power responsibly. Finally, then, sustainable development goals. The world has a common language now around sustainability. So if you don't have a sustainability policy, or if you're the relatively early stages of your procurement, then of your sustainable procurement strategy, then sustainable development goals are a very good place to start. Okay, before I take you into the next exercise, I'm going to stop sharing and just open the floor to any questions, any comments, anything you would like to say. So feel free to raise your hand on the Zoom, or just talk.
Maybe if there is silence.
I'm used to silence. That's okay. I can deal with silence. Come on, bring it on.
I will start with the first question, and I hope more will follow. As you know, as you may know, the mandatory social considerations are also in the Czech Republic from January now, and there is a big fear among procurers that suppliers won't deliver either anything or will somehow protest against these requirements or block the procurement process. So maybe can you tell us more about attitude of suppliers? And to us it's like that when you ask for something, they will deliver it, but they don't offer it actively or proactively. They have their CSR, but it's kind of separate from the service or product they offer. So somehow tell us something more about how to work with suppliers.
That's a big question. We'll cover some of this in day 2. I think it's applying a lot of what we spoke about this morning. So it's about setting out that policy at a very early stage. It's certainly about being clear around what you require and making it clear that you're serious about this. So the UK government's decision to apply a mandatory 10% has terrified the supply chain. And particularly a lot of businesses in some sectors, if I take the example of Serco, because I'm working with them now, they're a 100% business to government company. That's all they do. They supply services to governments, and they do lots of different things, but that's what they do. So if government is suddenly saying, we require you to deliver social value, they will have no business if they don't respond. They'll just lose to their competition. So I think making those clear and bold statements, don't be afraid of your supply chain refusing to supply you. They're not going to refuse to do business. That's how they work. And in many sectors, I mean, Serco is an extreme example, but if I take a lot of my clients that I work with in the construction sector, typically 60 to 70% of their work would be for public sector clients. And then, of course, they build for commercial developers and other businesses as well. But those sorts of organizations rely on public procurement for their living. So I'd encourage you to be tough and to be demanding of your supply chain. Obviously, in consultation with them. And I think, you know, I spoke about suppliers being stakeholders. So I think it's very important to have those discussions. Don't just put something out there and say, come and comply. To really explore with your suppliers what they can and can't achieve, what they might be prepared to do. But then probably push them, you know, at least 10% more than they say they would do, because they can always do more. You will always find suppliers out there that want to differentiate themselves around their sustainability. For example, I work a lot with Skanska, the Swedish construction company, and I know they operate in your part of the world. Well, they claim to be the most sustainable construction company in the world. They're going to want your business if you ask for sustainability standards, because they will consider then that they have a competitive advantage over their competition who maybe don't behave so sustainably. So I think it's, you know, be brave. Don't be afraid of your suppliers. You have the money and they want your money. It's a fairly basic commercial transaction, but do also engage them and get them involved with what you're asking for. Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question. Do we have any other questions or comments? Because if we don't, I'm going to set you your homework to do before you come back to the next session.
Maybe I will have a question.
Okay.
We are talking about sustainability within the suppliers chain. Is there a topic of sustainability in customers chain? Is it a topic in world?
Yes, it is. Certainly, that's an interesting question. Thank you, Martin. Yes, sometimes we talk about value chain as going up and down the supply chain. So certainly, if I probably the majority of my work is in the private sector, so I work more with businesses than governments. So if I take an organization like Serco, as I said, they're front and center of my mind right now, they're absolutely focused on what their customers are asking for and how they can win more business up the value chain, and then how they can replicate those requirements down the supply chain. So examples of that would be they'll have individual contracts to do various things around the world. So they do waste management services, citizen services, they run hospitals, they run schools, they run military establishments, transport infrastructure, they build ships in Australia, they run prisons, they do all sorts of stuff like that. So one of the things that they've committed to, or they're about to commit to, is they will always replicate the percentage evaluation criteria applied to them, say on social values. So for instance, the Justice Department in Australia applies 20% evaluation based on social value for running prisons. So any services or goods that they buy related to prisons, they will apply the same 20%. So you get this dynamic up and down the supply chain that works really well. So yeah, there is certainly a concept of value chain. also, some of the things again that Serco are looking at is when they tender for work, in order to be more competitive, they're looking at committing to certain sustainability objectives in partnership with their supply chain, so that they would actually declare a supply chain as part of a tender. So if they're running a prison, well, we'll stay with that same example. They'll maybe bring in subcontractors for cleaning, for facilities management, for, you know, whatever catering services, and they would integrate all of those services into the running of a prison. So they would actually line up their suppliers as part of a tender and commit to a series of sustainability objectives. And in some cases, they would commit to an independent audit of those objectives. And they're doing that because they think it will help them to win a contract. So it's not necessarily the demand that's coming from the client. So the client isn't necessarily saying, I want you to measure your performance and have it independently audited. What the client is saying is that they'll set out a definition of social value, and they'll say, right, 20% of the tender evaluation is on social value. And the service provider then is responding by saying, here are my social value targets, here's how I'm going to measure them, here's my supply chain that will help me deliver them, and here's an independent auditor that will evaluate my performance, rather than me just telling you what I've done. And you know, I know from my own experience that some things contractors claim aren't necessarily based in reality. And that's all as a response to this 20%. Because if they can score better than their competition on sustainability, and the price is the same, or in some cases their price might even be higher, and they will still win. So there is this, you're absolutely right, there is a concept of value chain up to the customer at the top of the organization. For a public body, really the value chain goes up to the political leadership in an organization, and what the politicians want to be able to claim to the electorate, and ultimately, of course, the general public. So thank you for that. Yes, it's a good question, and it's an interesting concept to think about. Any more questions? Okay.
Maybe
So, sorry, go on. Yeah, go on, Eva.
I would have actually one more question regarding setting the expectations of the supply chain or suppliers. We spoke about setting strategy or external declaration.
Yeah.
And in our project, we also discussed the possibility to have the code of conduct or ethical code of conduct. And I know in Great Britain, some organizations or the central government uses a code of conduct for suppliers to public sector. Can you tell us your opinion? Does it work? Is it too general, or is it working like some instrument that makes it clear?
Yes. Code of conduct and what I was talking about earlier, sustainability policy, sustainability charter, they go together, but for me, they're slightly different things. Codes of conduct, yes, lots of organizations use them, both government and private sector, and they set out the minimum expectations. So you know the fundamental principles on which we will operate. Those are often built into contracts as a precondition of doing business. The sustainability charter, policy, whatever you want to call it, that I described earlier, goes beyond that basic compliance and is prioritized by category of supply. So that's something that is not optional, but it's something that may be applied more strongly between one category and another. But your code of conduct would be something that says we expect all of our suppliers to comply with this. Does it work? Well, I guess one opinion could be it's a bit like, you know, the terms and the 32 pages of terms and conditions for your Apple device, where you go click, yeah, I agree, and nobody ever reads it. Is one opinion. On the other side of the equation, if, as I'm sure you will know as procurement professionals, if it's written into the contract, then of course you have recourse to law, to contract law. If a supplier is in breach, then potentially you have the right to remedy, you know, by terminating the contract or maybe by seeking compensation or whatever. So as a kind of a final backstop, it works. Codes of conduct also work well with due diligence. So for your particularly high risk suppliers, if you're going to look at the ethical standards in a little more detail, through looking at the financial history of the supplier, by way of example, the ownership structure of the supplier, if they've had any prosecutions against them. So you can actually set out a code of conduct where you can effect some due diligence of your supplier before you do business with them, to make sure that what they do as a business is actually in compliance with your code of conduct. What I wouldn't do is to try and confuse the two. So your charter, your policy, for me is a separate document. It would call up the code of conduct. So as part of my policy, I would say I expect all of my suppliers to comply with the code of conduct. And then the code of conduct will be a separate thing that's written into the contract, because then you would take elements of the policy that are important to your category of supply, and you would build those into the contract. Okay, final call for questions then. And if we don't have any more questions, I'll share my screen again, and just take you into the homework exercise. Okay, so what I would like you to do between now and the next session is to construct your own priority heat map. And I think, Ava, you've supplied a template for doing this, so you can either use the template or not, as the case may be. I don't really mind. Think about some categories of supply, some things that you buy. I've suggested 5. It could be more, it could be less, but as an organization, how does your supply chain break down into categories? And think of your important sustainability impacts. So this may be some thinking that's come out of today's session about the drivers or policies, or you may as an organization have already declared your policies. So you know, we're going to reduce our carbon emissions, we're going to increase our circular economy, we're going to put so much value of contract into the local community, whatever that might be. We're going to improve our biodiversity, we're going to have an electric vehicle fleet. There could be, you know, any of those objectives, so long as they're clear. And then please construct a heat map. So look at your high, medium and low impacts and start to think about how those different categories of supply actually play into your supply chain. So what we will ask you to do then, when you come back into day 2, into the second session, is to work in groups, and as a group pick one category of supply between you. So you'll need to go away and have a practice at your heat maps, and then when you come back together in groups, share what you've learned. But I will be asking you to pick one category of supply, look at your priority impacts for that category of supply, and then I'm going to take you through a procurement process where we think about how we will embed sustainability into each stage of that process. I think Ava has sent you a briefing note in Czech as well to make that completely clear. I'll stop there. Are there any questions about that exercise? Is that clear to everyone?
Maybe I will just add the information.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
And I will do it in Czech.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
My jsme vám vlastně zaslali v jednom z těch e-mailů odkaz na ten dokument se zadáním úkolu a vlastně na druhé straně najdete tu přípravu na druhý den. Je tam zopakovaný ten diagram, který jsem se snažila trochu i přeložit do češtiny. A vlastně tím zadáním bude vytvořit heatmap, tu teplotní mapu, jak to překládáme do češtiny, na 5 různých kategorií předmětů plnění a vybrat si jeden, o kterém se pak bude diskutovat v těch skupinách. Shaun teď zmiňoval, že jsem vám zaslala vzor té heatmap, já jsem vám ho ještě nezaslala, zašleme vám ho teď po tomto semináři, bude to excelovská tabulka, kterou budete moci využít a vlastně si hrát s těmi sloupci a s těmi řádky, doplňovat si to podle toho, kterému předmětu plnění se budete chtít věnovat. Možná vám přijde vhod i náš checklist nebo kontrolní list, který nastínuje některé ty oblasti, ta témata, které byste mohli zvažovat právě při přemýšlení o těch různých předmětech plnění, tak ten vám tam vložíme taky, pokud byste se na to chtěli odkazovat, ale ten je takový dost obecnější, můžete jít do větší hloubky. Ještě jeden komentář, my když už jsme s tou teplotní mapou vlastně pracovali, tak vždycky byla otázka, do jaké míry podrobnosti jít a je to vlastně na vás, nicméně pokud byste šli do nějaké, řekla bych, špatné míry podrobností, mohlo by se vám stát, že všechno v té teplotní mapě bude úplně červené, tak potom se nad tím nastavením toho musíte zamyslet, jak to udělat trochu jinak, anebo naopak, že by bylo všechno třeba nebo hodně podrobné nebo málo podrobné, tak by se mohlo stát, že všechno budete považovat za jako OK, všechno zelené, žádnou prioritu byste tam neviděli, tak se nad tím budete muset taky zamyslet, aby vlastně ta míra podrobnosti zkoumání těch problematických, těch rizik a těch příležitostí byla taková jako vlastně akorát. Myslím si, že to k tomu zadání je všechno. Určitě vezměte to jako příležitost. Já vím, že všichni máme hodně práce, ale je to příležitost se vlastně něco na tom naučit. Tak doufám, že se vám podaří všem se nad tím zamyslet a přijít příště na ten workshop nebo na ten seminář se svojí teplotní mapou, kterou budeme moci diskutovat. A Shaune, dávám ti ještě slovo na rozloučení a pak možná řeknu já ještě krátké rozloučení.
Okay, thank you, Ava. Just to add, actually, I can send you a link because we have a short e-learning package on heat mapping on ISO2400.org. It is only in English, unfortunately, but if the English speakers in the group might find that useful. So yeah, thanks everybody. I hope you've got some value out of today's session, and some of you would have refreshed your knowledge because you're already quite knowledgeable around the standard, and others I know are completely new to sustainable procurement. So I hope we were able to kind of satisfy everybody's requirements today. So we will be obviously reconvening in the second session. Thanks again to the interpreters. I think you do a great job, and certainly I got all of the translations through from the Czech very effectively and clearly. As I said at the beginning, it's the first time we've done simultaneous translation online, and I'm really pleased to see that it all worked and that the system worked on Zoom. So thank you for that. As I said, next time when we get together, there will be more group work. So this will be more me hearing from you and starting to understand a little bit better how we apply some of the principles we've learned in today's session into our day-to-day procurement. So please do come have a go at the heat map between now and the next session. Do have a go at the self-assessment if you haven't done it. I think you might find that more meaningful after today's session if you haven't done it already, and come prepared to do some work next time. So thank you very much, enjoy your day, and I'll hand back to Eva.
Děkuju. Moc děkuju všem, kteří jste se dnes připojili. Velmi děkuji Shaunovi za dnešní prezentaci a tuhle interaktivní práci s námi ve skupinách, což bylo pro mě poprvé a vlastně bylo to velice, fungovalo to a bylo to velice příjemné. A já bych vás chtěla jenom ještě upozornit na to příští datum. Vybrali jsme podobně jako dnešní datum, možná numerologicky zajímavého 2.2. Zase v 9 hodin budeme začínat, tak se budu těšit, že se zase všichni shledáme a budeme dál moci spolupracovat na těch úkolech. Děkuju a přeji hezký den.